President Trump's trade wars are continuing, with deals being made with many countries right now. The European Union tariff agreements impact 27 countries in the EU, carving out agreements for a range of strategic goods, including aircraft and certain chemicals. China, of course, the biggest trading partner with the U.S. But what are the impacts that these tariffs are having? Shanker Singham is a former U.S. advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative and a former advisor to the U.K. Trade Secretary. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks very much, Tom.
So a lot of people have talked about, tariffs and what does it mean for the economy. Let's just start on the U.K. What has been the situation previously to what President Trump has done, and what has he accomplished in these last 8 months?
Yeah, so I think what the Trump administration has done is they've essentially said, look, there are lots of countries around the world that have erected all kinds of trade barriers and regulatory barriers and so forth to the US. We've not done a good job over the last 30 years of solving them. So the US has lowered its tariff, while other countries continue to have lots of barriers, behind the border barriers, regulatory barriers, all of these things. So there's a handful of countries, like you mentioned the UK, it's one of them, the EU is one of them, Japan, Korea, there are others that have come to the table and said, look, we will lower some of these regulatory barriers, some of these things that you talk about are problems for the US, in exchange for a deal. And that's essentially what's happened. Now, August the 1st was that the date when the tariff pause ended and all the tariffs would go up to many countries. But what Jameson Greer, the US Trade Representative, has said is, look, we're open to deals from other countries even now. If countries want to make offers to how they're going to lower their barriers to the US, then we're willing to hear from those countries.
Why do countries do this? It seems like an artificial economic barrier to doing business.
Yeah, well, it's a good point, because all of these barriers that damage US exporters also damage the economies of the countries that do them. So one of the problems I think the Trump administration has seen is that, if you look at growth rates in the US and also in Western Europe and the G7, they've been going down, or they've been very static for a long time. That's why people complain about wage rates not growing up and inflation's going up and so on. So if that's happening, then you need to turn the ship around. And essentially that's what the administration has done. Now, it's a very big strategic move to try to turn the ship around, but the ship was taking on water and we were going down. And I think it's very important to realign the global trading system, which is what they've done.
Why was this system in place for as long as it was through both Republican and Democratic administrations?
Yeah, well, it was the whole trading system post the Second World War was never intended to only be about tariffs. In fact, from the very beginning, it was supposed to be about all of these different things. But the problem was that the tariff was the only thing that was dealt with. It was the only thing that was lowered. And you remember when the Cold War ended, we assumed that our vision of economic, liberal capitalism was going to be the one that the whole world would take on. That did not occur. You had many countries that continued to distort their markets and so on. And we did not have good tools to deal with that. So what the Trump administration has said is, we're going to take you back to that period in the 70s, for example, where the tariffs were quite high. And now we'll lower our tariff, but you have to lower your regulatory barriers and your other distortions and so on.
Is this a different take for the U.S. in these relationships? Because people, when they see the EU come together in the European Union and speak as one, suddenly when the United States starts to speak up for its own interests, they're accused of not being good trade partners.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is the EU in this negotiation, one of the complaints of the US was that the EU kept saying, we don't know what you want. Whereas actually, if you go back to the original Liberation Day tariffs, when the president waved that book around, the sad book that was the national trade estimate, was an inventory of foreign country trade barriers. So the EU has known for 30 years what the US has actually wanted, and they haven't done very much about it. So I think it's frustrating for the administration to hear countries say, we don't know what you want, because it's perfectly clear what the administration wants. They want to see reductions in all of those barriers that we've talked to them about for the last 30 years.
So since the Independence Day announcement, when the president laid out what his vision of this was going to be, there were a lot of concerns about an immediate economic impact. We quite haven't seen that. But what do we know about how the president's moves on tariff has affected the economy?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that are at play here. So we're kind of in an inflection point where we don't really know what's going to happen or what may happen in the future. We do know how we've come to be here. We've come to be here because we failed to deal with these barriers. And if you're a steel worker in Ohio who lost your job to a Chinese steel mill that's fully, massively subsidized and distorted, you need to see something. You need to see some kind of policy reaction to that, which is what we've seen. Now, if countries don't respond, they don't lower their barriers, then the tariffs will remain high, and that will be a negative result for for the world and for them in particular. But if they actually lower their barriers and the tariff comes down as a result, you've got to remember also that the US is lowering its own regulatory barriers. So you could have a situation where the US economy is very attractive to foreign investors, very attractive to capital. You've got the tax rate passed as well, so very attractive in that respect, and that will be a good result for the US economy.
We got about 30 seconds. Does the fact that we were able to reach an agreement with the EU tend to bode well for us to be able to reach agreements with other nations?
Well, we've been trying to reach an agreement with the EU for, again, about 25, 30 years, transatlantic free trade agreement, TTIP, etc. We failed to do that. This is the first time there's been an agreement with the EU. It needs to be fleshed out. We need to see more details, but it is very significant that this has happened at all.
Shanker Singham is a former trade advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative and former advisor to the U.K. Trade Secretary. We thank you so much for explaining a lot of these things, because people
thank you very much.
hear about it all the time. It's good insight on it.